Hello, my name is Julie, and today I'm talking about all of the books that I read in May. So May was a very good reading month for me. I kind of called it. I've had the highest rated month of the year so far. I read the most books that I've read in the year so far, and the second most amount of pages. Not too shabby. Let's talk about my stats. I read 13 books in May, kind of helped by the fact that 2 were novellas. I read 4,344 pages with an average rating of 3.92. That is far above my average. I gave one 5-star, but there's one that I'm thinking of boosting up to be a second 5-star. The books had an average page count of 333, and I read about 139 pages a day. I read 6 books from my shelf, added 13 to my TBR because I had my birthday, and I unhauled 0 from my TBR, so my net TBR shelf is at -2 for the year. Star ratings, we have a great bell curve. The lowest rating I gave out was in the realm of a 3. As for genres, my number 1 was fantasy, number 2 was mystery, thriller, horror, and then we have just a mix otherwise. For mediums, entirely normal, 30% of my books were audiobooks. I read 3 first in series and the rest were standalones, and then all of the books that I read were considered adult. The first book that I read this month was a nonfiction, and that is The End of Everything, Astrophysically Speaking by Dr. Katie Mack. This is an astrophysics book for the general public about the different ways that we believe that the universe could end, given current science. I studied physics in school some. It was my minor, not my major, but I have been fascinated with cosmology, which is sort of how I got into my field in the first place. I read this book and I find out that she works at my alma mater. Insane coincidence. Not only that, she worked there the whole time I was there, and I knew who she was. And I didn't, know that she worked at my school. I need to go get this signed sometime. Anyway, this has a good amount of pre-reading at the beginning that kind of gives you some context, especially about how the universe began, how we know the things that we know, different theories. Then it goes to the 5 biggest theories about how the universe could possibly end. We have the Big Crunch, in which the universe's expansion reverses and we come back to a singularity. There is the heat death, where everything spreads out so much that entropy ends. There's the Big Rip, where the universe's expansion accelerates so that even the smallest structures of atoms can't stay together. There's vacuum decay, which I can't explain very well, and bounce, which is like a big crunch creates a new universe. Like most nonfiction that is about science, it took me a minute to get through this. I didn't have my normal reading speed because I was trying to comprehend everything. I do have a base knowledge of this, especially in the first 3 of the theories, and I think she does do a pretty good job of getting the layman up to speed. This isn't for somebody who took graduate level physics. This is for somebody who might not know much about the subject at all. And I think she does a really good job being relatable and trying to speak without using too much jargon. There's also a good amount of graphs and images to help you picture what she's actually talking about. And I just had a really good time sitting with this, thinking about the science and what the different implications would mean. And as you can tell from the title, she sets out to make this a fun reading experience, and I think she does a pretty good job. I don't really have a rating for this because it is an informational nonfiction book, but I had a solid time with this. Then for my library, I got The Haunting of Alejandra by V. Castro. So this is a horror book that is inspired by La Llorona, or The Weeping Woman, which is a classic Mexican folklore story. And our main character is a modern mom. She did not want to be, but she is forced to be a stay-at-home mom, and her husband kind of has no empathy for her, sees her as a thing to take care of his progeny. She is at her wit's end not being able to be her own person. And, as much as she loves her children, it's really being a strain on her. At this moment where she's at her wit's end, really struggling, she starts seeing this ghost, and she decides to finally reach out to a therapist, and this therapist is helping her out. Female rage. Female rage is so good. I loved this book. When I was reading this book, I was like, I want to write something like this. Obviously, I'm not Mexican, so I'm not writing a Mexican horror book, but like everything about this, I loved the language. I loved how this is a horror about modern day female experiences. Not only that, we also have chapters that are her ancestors. There are people from hundreds of years ago who we see people a couple generations back. I thought that the messages of this book were fantastic. I loved the language, the pacing. I really didn't want to put this book down. So this is a 5-star. I picked this up from the library on a whim. I almost put it back, and I'm so glad I didn't. Then I listened to Confessions by Kanae Minato. This is a suspense mystery thriller that was translated from Japanese. This is told in like 6 sections, recounting the same months leading up to a murder, what actually happened in the murder, and every new character we get narrating this thing, we get more information about what really happened. So it starts off with a teacher confronting her middle school students on the last day of school, saying that she believes that 2 of them killed her daughter. This is the first of 2 times this month that I had preconceived notions about a book that were totally wrong. So I thought that this book was like set in one day and the entire book was the teacher talking to the students. That's not the case. It is split into those 6 sections where we run through the case 6 different times. So that made, to me, the first section by far the most engaging. I think the first section of this book could have been a short story on its own. Just standalone, 40 pages of genius. It was awesome. I think there were some perspectives that I liked more than others. One thing that was unique about this is that each of these is supposed to be a slightly different format. So the first chapter is all just a one-sided dialogue. One of the chapters is a letter. One of them is like a blog post. This does a good job of spreading out reveals that I thought was pretty good and having a sort of dominoes falling effect throughout it. So I definitely would recommend this. It kept me engaged. It's not a new favorite, but pretty good. 4 stars. Then I read This Time Tomorrow by Emma Straub. This is a speculative literary fiction about our main character, who is a 30-something woman who is living in New York City. She is really not satisfied with her life. Especially, she is very upset because her father is dying, who is famous for having written a very popular time travel book. On her 40th birthday, drunk, kind of stumbling around, stumbles into her dad's shed, and when she wakes up, it is her 16th birthday, and she gets to see her dad hale and healthy again. She can also hang out with her best friend again, have her 16th birthday party again, hang out with her crush who made out with somebody else that night. And she wants to find out if by doing these things, she can change her present. Time travel is one of my favorite tropes of all time. It's my favorite thing. If I see that there's a movie or a TV show or a book with time travel in it, I'm going to want to consume that thing. I knew going into this that this was on the literary side of things. Literary time travel novels have a couple of things that they stick to, and I think that this was one of those. This does exactly what it says on the tin. Nothing particularly surprised me. It did what I thought it would do. I don't want to give away all of the ways that the time travel works in this book, but it is a good combination of a woman taking charge of her life, but also coming to grips and accepting some of the bad things about her life. I liked the relationship that she had with her dad, but honestly, from the synopsis, I thought it was going to be a bigger portion of this book. I think she goes on about her crush for a little bit too long. I liked especially how, like, the ending third of the book was paced. I thought that that was cool. Very typical literary fiction time travel novel. I gave it like a 3.25. Then I listened to Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. This is a sci-fi horror that came very highly recommended to me by a couple people I know. You know how I said that I might have one book that might move up to a 5-star? This is another one, so I actually have 2 that are possible push up to a 5-star contenders. This is about our main character who went through a really troublesome past. So she has spent a lot of her adult life on this really remote outpost way out in the galaxy where they're doing like satellite communications maintenance. And most people don't want this job because it's really remote, but she doesn't want to be around people or get attached to them. She and her crew end up on the last day that they're supposed to be there finding a SOS signal. They go and investigate it, and it turns out it is the wreckage of essentially sci-fi Titanic. There was a space liner cruise ship that was sent out 20 years ago that ended up going missing 6 months into its 1-year journey. There was a ton of rich and important people on board, and nobody knew what happened to it. And her crew decides to go to this ship to claim the wreckage, get their finder's fee. But we also see our main character after the events of this, when it appears that her entire crew is dead and she was the only survivor. And she is literally being haunted by them, like the visions she's seen of her mother her whole life. This was such an awesome combination of sci-fi and horror. I love genre blending, and I thought that this did a fantastic job of it. There is so much of the sci-fi-ness, but there is so much of the horror, and I thought that every single aspect of this was keeping me on my toes. I listened to the vast majority of this in one very long car ride, and I was having a blast. I was on the edge of my seat. I was invested in our characters making it out safely, things going well, finding out what the mystery was, which I did think was very well plotted. The horror elements of this were so great. We have, a little bit of our typical unreliable narrator character where she is prone to hallucinations. She has had them for a good portion of her life, and now also on the ship, other people are starting to have hallucinations. So she doesn't even know what's her hallucination and what's a ship hallucination and what's real. Lots of layers there. This was so engrossing. For the audiobook, I kind of thought that there were some weird accent things going on, like the narrator's accent wasn't always consistent, but the acting of it was so good that negates it. You're fine. I don't want to say much more about it because I want everyone to be able to experience this book fully and not know much more, so I'm gonna stop there, but I seriously don't have a bad thing to say about this book. I'm gonna give it the 5 stars. It's getting the 5. Then I decided to read The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. Somehow there wasn't a wait for the 2 whole copies in my library system, even though this just came out. Kind of tells you about the demographic of people in my area. I have read Leigh Bardugo before. This synopsis was so interesting to me that I decided I'm gonna read this. If I don't like it, this is my last Leigh Bardugo. This is about our main character who is a servant during the Spanish Inquisition period. And our main character has a little bit of what seems like everyday magic, like she can fix rolls that were burnt. She doesn't know much about it, but when her mistress, who's kind of hurting for cash, finds out about this magic, she decides to flaunt it and sort of throw our main character into situations that she doesn't want to be in. And it turns out that the king is going to be holding a competition for a few magicians in the area, and our main character is signed up in a forceful way to do this. There is a rich man that is helping finance her way to get to the competition, and he has a man with him who also seems to have some magic, and that's our familiar. This book does exactly like it says on the tin. Like This Time Tomorrow, you know exactly what you're getting into, and the author doesn't really deviate from that. I thought that the setting of the Spanish Inquisition was really cool. That was probably the strongest element for me. I did feel like it was set in that area. Not a whole lot else stood out to me. I like some of our characters' journey and how the questions she's trying to have about what's the safest thing for her to do, but I didn't feel very strongly about the characters. I didn't feel like I had a large grasp on what the magic was supposed to be. I don't think the magic is much of the point of the book. It's more like magic in such a strict society and what those societies do to somebody. I did like the ending of this book quite a bit. I think that's like the only way it could have gone. I don't think there was anything that I particularly disliked about this book. There just wasn't anything that I felt super strongly about. So around the 3.5 range. Then for my book club 3 of clubs, this quarter we are reading Friends to Lovers books. And for this month, I picked out Here We Go Again by Alison Cochrane, who wrote The Charm Offensive and Kiss Her Once for Me. I've read The Charm Offensive. I had a lot of fun with that book. And this one is a little bit more of a serious rom-com. It is weird. Some of the aspects of this are very rom-com, but there is a very serious aspect of this as well. But our main characters are Logan and Rosemary, and these two were in middle school best friends. Something happened to them that by the time they got to high school, they hated each other's guts. And now both of them as adults have gone back to be teachers at their high school alongside their mentor, Joe, who is an out gay man who both of them adored. Now Joe has only a few months to live. As his dying wish, he wants the two of them to take him on a road trip to his house in Maine. And the two of them do not want to do this together. They don't think it's the best thing for Joe, but they respect his wishes and want to give him the best send-off they can. So they decide to go through with it, even though they're still hating on each other. The road trip's not going to go as planned, them hating each other is not going to go as planned, and they're going to learn a lot along the way. I read this in one sitting on a plane ride. I think this was a great plane read. It's very fast-paced. It's the romance font and everything where you can get through it really quickly. But there was a lot to like about this book. I think the strongest part of this book is the Joe plot of these two learning more about their mentor and trying to care for him however they can, trying to give him the best while he's also in a lot of pain. And I really like that this didn't shy away from some of the pretty ugly aspects of dying. It's not talking about it all the time, but it was enough that it did feel realistic. And I liked both of our main characters having their own individual arcs of things that they need to work through about themselves before the two of them could be together. I did like the road trip aspect of this. It was fun because one of the sites that they visited, I went to like a month ago. There were a couple of things that bothered me. Logan, every time that she has an exclamation, she says the name of some queer icon with fucking in the middle. Like, so she'll say Elton fucking John, Tegan and fucking Sarah, like constantly. It is so annoying, and this author went all in on this one bit. If somebody actually did that in real life as frequently as this main character does, I would punch them in the face. I was emotionally invested in the journey of getting Joe to Maine, but I will say that I think the romance of this kind of took a back seat, and I didn't find myself as invested in wanting them to be together as I did with her previous book. This is good, giving it in the realm of a 4. Then I got this arc from Tor, and that is The Fireborn Blade by Charlotte Bond. This is out already, so you can pick up your own copy. This is the first in a fantasy novella series. This felt to me like the Witcher short stories, and it is about our main character, Madeline, who is a knight in a world where women aren't really allowed to be knights. She has been disgraced, and she has decided that the way to undisgrace herself is to get the Fireborn Blade, which is a sword that is guarded by a fierce dragon that has been prophesied that no living man could ever get it. So maybe a woman could. My main complaint about this book is that 50% of this book is not about Madeley. So it has a lot of like historical inserts of people who have tried to fight dragons before and like their notes and things that have happened to them. But this book is only 164 pages long. 50% of the book, or even like 30-40% of the book being stuff that doesn't have to do with our main character, didn't entirely work for me. I really wanted to get to know Madeley more. I wanted to get to know our other main characters more, especially because this feels like it's going to be a pretty unique fantasy world in terms of what sort of magic is used all the time. I really liked what we did see. I thought the ending of this book was fantastic and definitely would make me want to pick up a sequel. But I think if the author had decided to flesh out a little bit more and spend more time with the scenes of our main character, adding more scenes to give us a little bit more background into what's going on, this would have been even better. I might pick up the sequel because it is a novella, but ultimately I wanted to have more development, so I'm giving this around a 3. Then I read The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. This is the first in a fantasy trilogy that is inspired by Norse mythology. In this world, the gods had a final battle and they all died. We follow a couple of main characters. One is a huntress who is trying to protect her family, investigating deaths happening in her community. One is a former slave or thrall who is trying to avenge his sister, and to do so gets tied up into a mercenary guild. And the third is a noblewoman disguising herself as one of these people in a mercenary guild so that she can earn her own battle fame and not be sold off to the highest bidder. I don't know what didn't exactly click about this book to me. I really liked the huntress main character. I liked the plotting of a lot of this. I just was dragging through this book. I think maybe because I went off of a couple books that didn't take very long to get to, and that was a very dense fantasy, but it felt like I just could not make progress. There were some things that I kind of saw coming, but I don't know if that was intentional or not. More than anything, I can see this being a TV show, like in The Witcher, Game of Thrones style. I just felt like I wasn't as invested in the world. I thought that the plots that our main characters follow were good, but I didn't feel particularly invested. I didn't feel like I felt the stakes. I kind of felt like I wasn't following everything that was happening. And maybe that means that I was accidentally speeding through it, but I just didn't quite click with this in a way that's kind of hard to describe. I don't really know why. I would potentially be interested in continuing in the series. I think maybe if I could get the audiobook, but I do think that the ending of this book has a lot of interesting implications for how the world is going to change in the future, which could make me like the sequels more. So I'm giving this around a 3.5. Objectively, I think this is a good book, but I didn't feel like I got the reaction I wanted out of it. Then I finally read The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. This has been on my shelf for too long, partially because this got pretty middling reviews after The Guest List got great reviews. I haven't read either, so I thought that this wasn't going to be really great, but I had a fun time. Our main character, Jess, is kind of a mess, and she needs somewhere to stay, so she calls up her half-brother, who they're very different, but they have depended on each other in the past from being in foster care. The day that she is getting there, he leaves her a message saying how to get there and is cut off abruptly, and there's some strange noises in the background, and when she gets there, he is no longer there, even though he was supposed to be there to pick her up. We follow Jess trying to investigate what happened to Ben, and we also have shorter chapters from the different residents of the building. You have the socialite, the nice guy, the alcoholic, the girl on the verge, and the concierge. Everyone's a neighbor, everyone's a suspect, and everyone knows something they're not telling. Great setup. I feel like if you want a not comedic version of Only Murders in the Building, this is a pretty typical thriller in terms of tone. It doesn't take itself too seriously, but it's not comedic like Only Murders is. I flew through this book and I had so many theories going on. I guessed a couple of the twists, but not all of them, and I had a really good time trying to find out who done it. I love an isolated thriller where basically it all takes place in one location. I love multi-perspective thrillers where we're getting information from different places. And I thought this did a really good job spreading out reveals throughout the book, so you're sort of peeling back layers of the onion. I had low expectations going into this one, so that might have informed my experience a little bit, but I ultimately had a good time with this, so giving it a 4. Then I listened to The Will of the Many by James Islington. This is a Roman-inspired future fantasy. So centuries ago, there was this thing called a cataclysm where society essentially crumbled. We don't have any record of what was going on, and society had to build itself back up. And right now there is an empire called the Hierarchy, which very much mirrors ancient Roman society that has conquered a lot of the known world. And our main character is secretly the prince of the last kingdom that fell to the Hierarchy. He's at an orphanage, he does underground fighting, but when he shows off too much of his powers, a pretty powerful person up in the Hierarchy adopts him and has him sent off to this school for people to work in the Hierarchy to try to investigate what happened when his brother was killed there. So the magic system in this is will. So each person is imbued with will, which is kind of like a soul almost, but in a magic way. Depending on where you are in the Hierarchy, the people at the bottom give up their soul to the people who are higher than them. So the more power you have in this society politically is also the more powerful you are magically, because the people below you have literally given you their will. I have been looking for a new fantasy favorite, and this might be it. I thought this was awesome. I think the first portion of this book, I struggled to get into it. Maybe I wasn't like paying attention to the audiobook enough, but I think it just took a minute for me to really find my bearings. But by the end, I was on the edge of my seat and blown away by the ending. I really enjoyed our main character. I've heard him compared to Kvothe from The Name of the Wind. I liked a lot of the different plot points that we go through, how like, even though this has like a magic school element to it, there's so much that's going on that it didn't lock itself into being that. I wish we knew more about how will really works, but based on the ending of this book, we are going to learn so much more in book 2. Storage filled up, so the camera might have changed positions, but I don't know, I really liked our main character. I love the journey that he's on. I love all like the spying type stuff he's having to do. I like interacting with our side characters and the political maneuvering and everything. Overall, awesome, and this is why I like fantasy books. I have heard people compare this to Name of the Wind, so if you're a fan of that, maybe check this out. Then I read another arc that I got from Tor, this time from Tor Forge, and that is Masquerade by Oosei Guyomi. So I went into this book thinking it was a historical fantasy, and I was totally wrong. This is just a historical fiction, no fantasy element. I'm gonna tell you really quickly why I thought it was fantasy. First of all, I got it in a box of books from Tor. I requested it, but it was on like Tor's website. It didn't say it wasn't fantasy. The #1 genre it has listed on Goodreads is fantasy, so that means that a lot of other people have shelved it as fantasy. then it is considered a light reimagining of the myth of Persephone. The author that blurbs the book is a fantasy author, and then within the first pages there are mentions of the Orisas that are Western African mythological gods, and also witches. So I go into this being like, okay, historical fantasy in 15th century West Africa, where we're gonna have a little bit of a Persephone thing going on. Awesome. It is just historical fiction, but I do think that this will have appeal for fantasy fans because of the political maneuvering. This reminded me a little bit of City of Brass for some reason. I think the whole like outsider comes to a kingdom where people have like a lot of set political structures. That reminded me of it. I think the main character is pretty different from the main character of City of Brass, but she was very compelling to read from. And our main character, Ododo, is a blacksmith, which at the time was a position that was given to women who were essentially cast out of society, and they're looked down on and also considered witches. She is minding her own business one day when presumably a vagrant comes up to her, kind of flirts with her or whatever. A couple days later, she is kidnapped. It turns out that the vagrant was actually the king of Yorubaland, who just conquered Timbuktu, where she lives. He has decided that she is going to be his bride. And she's like, oh, okay, well, I don't have to worry about poverty here. But she realizes she doesn't have a lot of agency here, so she is doing everything in her power to keep her own agency and forge her own power. I got halfway through this book before I realized that she didn't have magical powers that were going to manifest or whatever, but I still really enjoyed our main character's journey. She's not a great person all of the time, but she's better than a lot of the pretty evil people around her. There were a couple times where I was definitely like, what is this main character thinking? And I was questioning whether I, as a reader, was supposed to be rooting for her in this moment. And at the time, it was kind of putting a bad taste in my mouth. But on some of those, I do think that I am supposed to be critiquing her. So I think we're good on that part. Our main character, by the end, does say that she loves the king who kidnapped her. And I don't see why. There is no reason to me why she should love this man. I don't know, I thought this was a pretty fascinating one. I think I'll be thinking about it for a while. There was a portion of this where I thought that this wasn't going to go my way, and it ended up going my way. The very ending of this book saved the last third of this book because I thought that it was going in an entirely different direction for a minute. So this was really solid. I think Tor definitely, specifically, I guess, Forge, needs to work on advertising this book correctly. I didn't want to put it down, and I look forward to reading more from this author. So I was giving this in the realm of a 4. And the last book that I read in May, I finished an hour ago, and that is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. This is a book translated from Korean about a woman who is very ordinary, very subservient, and one day she starts having very violent dreams about meat, and she decides to become a vegetarian. This absolutely disrupts her family. We see from 3 different perspectives: her husband, her brother-in-law, and her sister. And through these 3 different narratives, we see the pressure that is put on her and the way that she is treated very poorly, especially when she tries to do anything for herself, but then how that leads to her having a mental breakdown. I thought it was so interesting to see our main character from the outside, but I think that this did such a good job of characterizing our main character even when we are 95% of the time not seeing from her perspective. And because we get the 3 different points of view, we get to see her in different ways. While she is ultimately suffering pretty badly, not being able to really think straight because of the dreams that she is haunted by, how she is taking this out on her own body. So there's some like disturbing stuff that happens in this book. It's mostly just the first third where the most upsetting things happen. But I just thought that this has so much that I need to think about. Even though it's called The Vegetarian, it's not really about vegetarianism. The author talked about in an interview that it was about the impossibility of innocence, which I thought was really profound. And I think that this is another one of like a character study that's going to stay with me for a while, so I'm also giving this a solid 4. Even though I read so much this month, how is this all I have to show for it? All the short books that I read this month. Those are all of the books that I read in May. Let me know what you read in May. What were your favorite books? What would you recommend to me? If you've read any of these books or want to read any of them now, let me know. Love to talk about them with you. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. If you would like to follow me anywhere, you can subscribe down below or click the link in the description for all of my links in one. My Goodreads, my Instagram, my Etsy, my book club, all of that is down there. And as always, I will see you in the next one.